Hi everyone! The last time that we read the Parker Inheritance, Siobhan had just found out that Reggie had died and didn't get to find out the truth about him becoming James Parker. And she was in the kitchen talking with her father. So that's where I'm going to start up again. After a few seconds of silence, he slowly rose from the chair and began limping toward the wall. He owned a cane, but was too proud to use it. A thick salt and pepper beard now covered his face, perhaps to hide the scars from his attack. Big Dub made it halfway across the room before Siobhan finally marched past him. She flipped off the light. There. He sighed. Mind helping me back to my seat? Reluctantly, she walked to him. Even before taking his arm, she could smell the alcohol in his breath. She helped him return to his chair, then turned to leave. Wait, he said, grabbing her arm. Look, I'm sorry what happened to the boy. Reggie, Siobhan said, yanking her arm away from him. Can't you at least call him by his name? Her father nodded. I know how much you cared for him. For Reggie. And while I don't think he was the right boy for you... Daddy, she warned. Well, he wasn't. The boy was poor, with light skin. And look, I had to marry somebody light-skinned, but you didn't need to. Did it ever occur to you that I loved Reggie for who he was, and not for his money or his skin tone? She shook her head. And how can you even say something like that, being married to Mama? Leave me and your mama out of this, he snapped. Now, like I said, I didn't approve of the boy, but I didn't want anything like this to happen to him. But don't worry, as soon as I get better, I'll finish what he started. Now she frowned. I don't understand. Mary and Alan, her father said. Reggie took one eye, maybe I can take the other. I've been talking to Smitty about it, and we think... Are you serious? She gave her father... Oh. Hi, Fifi. Are you serious? She gave her father a sad, pathetic laugh. You want to attack Mary and Alan? You could barely walk. He destroyed my life, he yelled. Our life. We'd still be in Lambert if you didn't make that stupid bet, she yelled back. I'd still be at Perkins, and you would still have a job, and no one would be hurt, and Reggie wouldn't be dead. She took a few ragged breaths. This was another thing that had happened since she moved. She'd found her voice. Before, she'd been passive in her rebellion, sneaking off to see Reggie, refusing to play tennis. Now, whenever her father, or really anyone, challenged her, she roared back. Don't you want to get back at the Allens? Her father said. Don't you want justice for Reggie? Justice is trying to work with the police, with lawyers, trying to change the system, she said. You want revenge. And this has nothing to do with Reggie. It's all about you. Siobhan left the room then. She was through talking to her father. It was easy for him to be bold when he was propped up by liquor and bravado. But when the time came to actually put in the real work, going to therapy, trying to find a new job, taking responsibility for his actions, he would shrink back into the shell of a man he had become. Her mother had already begun to move on. She'd become involved with the local NAACP chapter. She was going to church again. She had friends outside of their home. Leanne Washington had decided not to let Big Dub's mistakes define her, and neither would Siobhan. Siobhan Washington wouldn't return to Lambert until 1985, 28 years after she and her family were driven away. After years of neglect, the city was finally renovating Vickers Park. In addition to new playground equipment, they had planned to add tennis courts, and to thank the community input, they had decided to dedicate the courts to her father. Siobhan wanted to be there when the plaque was unveiled. Her father had passed away the fall of 1962, just before Siobhan graduated from college. Her mother had filled in some of the blanks about her father's childhood, including how he'd been mistreated because of his skin tone and his family's poverty. Her father had been consumed by hate for others, and perhaps even for himself. But he had still been a great man, and had done much for the community. He deserved to be recognized. By now, Siobhan had moved from the classroom and was now serving as a second-year school librarian. Being surrounded by stacks of books every day, along with the upcoming tennis court dedication, caused Siobhan to think more about Reggie than she ever had. His grandmother had passed away recently. Siobhan worried she was the only person left in the world who remembered him. One night, she pulled a small memory box from the top of her closet. Inside was the red scarf she'd worn at the tennis game. The faded note she'd found at the locker all those years ago, asking her to meet at the park. There was also a creased picture of the tennis team that she'd cut out of the Perkins yearbook. Reggie stood on one side of the photo, and she on the other. but when she folded it the right way, she was standing right beside Reggie, her arms pressed against his. And there was the bracelet. She stopped wearing it when she got married and hadn't thought to put it back on after her divorce. But now, as she was preparing to return to Lambert, it felt right to have it on her wrist again. It was a way to bring Reggie with her as well. On a whim, she decided to slip off to Lambert a few weeks before the dedication. So much had changed about the city, yet there were things that still brought it right back to 1957. PJ's on Darling Avenue, still serving their daily special. Perkins High School, now integrated, but still the pride of the African American community. Mount Carmel, her mother's home away from home. And Vickers Park, where she once fell in love with a boy, and where he loved her back. It was spring, and everything was beginning to turn green. The park was already under renovation. The city had dug up a lot of the old trees to make room for a pavilion and the tennis courts. But their old oak tree was still there. She placed her hand against the tree's rough bark and thought about all the secrets she'd whispered underneath its branches, all the kisses she shared underneath its canopy of leaves. If she had known what would have happened to Reggie, she would have taken more pictures of him, with him. Maybe she would have even carved their initials into the bark so they could be together forever. Maybe. She walked over to the location of the future tennis courts. The ground had been dug up. The soil was still fresh from where the deep tree roots had been. She wished she had something of Reggie's from back then. She wanted to place a memento in the dirt underneath the green courts. He had been forgotten by so many people, but he deserved to be memorialized too. Reggie was important, and even in death, she wanted him to know that. She slipped off her bracelet. Old and scratched, it looked more like something a child would win from a carnival than a piece of jewelry suitable for a woman her age. She had already memorized every curve of her initials, the feel of the word love against her skin. Perhaps she didn't need the bracelet anymore. She had him in her head and in her heart, and that was what was most important. But as she held the bracelet over that deep, dark hole, she still didn't know if she could let him go. Chapter 41. I found the lyrics to September yesterday, Candace said as she entered Brandon's kitchen late Thursday morning. What do you want on your chili cheese dog? Brandon grinned. He had 3 sports books from the library open in front of him, one on football and 2 on tennis. Don't feel bad, he said. When I was little, I once heard our pastor talking about the 7 seals in the book of Revelations. I thought he was talking about real seals, like cute little animals. I had a thing for Arctic mammals. How old were you when you figured out the truth? 6, but that's beside the point, he said. Like my mom says, sometimes we hear what we want to hear and see what we want to see. He flipped a page. What have you been up to? Just playing mental twister, Candace said, not looking at him. And packing. Oh yeah, 9 days. She was actually down to 8, but she didn't want to say that. Candace and Brandon didn't make much headway that day. Partially because they were stuck, and partially because Candace came down with a huge case of indigestion. Both Brandon and Tori had warned her not to eat 2 chili cheese dogs, but the smell overrode her common sense, and she ended up scarfing them down. One had extra onions. That night, Candace got up to find something to soothe her stomach. She heard her mother heavy breathing as she passed her room. Both of her parents snored, but the 2 noises had always seemed to fit together. To her it sounded like melody and harmony. We hear what we want to hear. We see what we want to see. It seemed like everything that summer had been pointing to that. It was on the tip of everyone's tongue in the misunderstood lyrics of her favorite song and stamped on the jewelry she'd owned for almost half of her life. Parker's Mystery was the perfect example of seeing what you want to see and hearing what you want to hear. 2 instead of 2. T-O-O instead of T-W-O. F-O-R instead of F-O-U-R. P-I-E instead of P-I. And a white man from Colorado instead of a black man from South Carolina. Candace found a box of chewable antacids in the cabinet. She washed them down and then returned to her room. The letter sat unfolded on her nightstand. She had read it so many times that she had almost had it memorized, though she still had to remind herself to think Siobhan instead of Siobhan. She paused. We hear what we want to hear. We see what we want to see. Candace scanned the letter until she found the first clue. 1. Siobhan's father loved tennis, but he grew up idolizing a team in another sport. His first love was baseball. The Luling Oilers. Oilers. It was a funny-looking word. At least in her head. A funny-sounding word. She crept into her mother's room and took the cell phone from her purse. Her mom stirred but didn't wake up. Back in her room, Candace opened the web browser and typed in number and Oilers and hit search. Brandon had run a search like this before, but they had been looking for numbers related to sports. They hadn't tried Luling Oilers plus number, and then Houston Oilers plus number, even Biz Mackey plus number. But now, right at the top of the browser, was exactly what Candace and Brandon had been looking for. It had been there the entire time. They just hadn't been able to see it. And that's what I'm gonna stop at. The next chapter is chapter 42, and it is about James Parker. But it sounds like at the end of that chapter that Candace just figured out part of the mystery. What do you think she found out about the Luling Oilers that is going to help them solve the mystery?